I wanted everybody to know. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
You're in the right place.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
I welcome you all to this great training by Walk Boston, who are just exceptional in the work they've done around the state. The Massachusetts Council on Aging, who said, you know, if you improve things for older people like myself, then you improve it for the whole community. So, because every age will benefit from the improvements that we have made. So, we have Walk Boston here, and as I was saying, they have made improvements. You know, when I first knew their name was Walk Boston, I thought, oh boy, they're doing great work in Boston. And it took me a while to learn that they're doing great work in Boston and in cities and towns and in rural places that have their own problems around making it safe for walking. So I'm really happy to have them with us today.
So my name's Wendy Landman. I'm the Executive Director of Walk Boston. This is Brendan Carney, who's our Communications Manager, and Kasha Hart, who's an intern with us this summer. And as Julie said, we actually do work all over the state. In fact, at the last count, we had worked with 101 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And walking is something that everybody can do. It's sort of the entry, most basic form of physical activity that people have, and we're really excited that it's something that has gained more traction in the public health community and the health community, that people understand that walking is exercise, and that in fact people that walk regularly, it helps them stay healthy at least as well as, you know, very running and even more vigorous forms of exercise. And one of the things that we have started doing recently, and which Julie mentioned, is that the Department of Public Health, put a little grant program out for communities to work specifically with seniors around walking issues. And so that's something that we've started doing in a number of places. So a couple weeks ago, I was at a meeting in Weymouth. Weymouth, I don't know how many of you know it, but it's a very different kind of a place from Fall River. But when we had a meeting there, also a lot of people turned out, like you have here, because really there's a lot of interest in it, and a lot of people want to be able to keep walking to maintain their independence and to stay healthy. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people are talking about, and probably most of you know the term aging in place, which is, in other words, living in your own home, taking care of yourself, and being able to get around, even if you have to stop driving eventually, that if there are good walking conditions and the destinations that you need for your daily activities within walking distance of where you live, that's something that's very doable, and it's very different. Interestingly, this is just one of those little factoids that those of us in the walking world like to know about. So New York City, until about 5 years ago, the longevity in New York City, when you controlled for income and race and you know, the kind of things that social scientists do when they're looking at this, New York City had a shorter lifespan than the average for the country. And now New York City has a longer lifespan than the rest of the country when you control for all those things. And the theory that the head of the New York City Public Health Department had is that it's because New Yorkers walk to get around, and they walk pretty fast. And the subway system in New York was built before the days when escalators and elevators were required. So people actually go up and down stairs as part of their daily activities getting around. And that's the theory when you control for things like income and access to health care and all those other things, that New Yorkers actually live longer, which is a pretty interesting change in public health. That the thing that's making us unhealthy now is actually lack of physical activity, as opposed to the many other things that used to be the primary drivers for living a long and healthy life. So you have good company in wanting to walk and wanting to make sure that Fall River works as a place to walk. So what we're going to do today is do a little training session about what goes into a good walking environment. What we're going to focus on here is the built environment, namely the physical pieces of the environment that make a difference for walking. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about some of the other things that make for a walkable environment. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and do this in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And then what we're going to do is go out and do what we call a walk audit in this neighborhood. And we're going to divide up into two groups. One group is going to go toward Route 81 to the main street to do go around that, and the other group is going to go in the opposite direction. And I realize I forget the name of the street that we're going to, which is
Stafford.
Yes, thank you. To go up and look at Stafford Street and look at the bus stops and the walk to the park. Okay, but we really do think of this as a training to show you how to do this. Not a be-all and end-all that this is the place necessarily that you'd want to do the audit. There are lots of other parts of the community where those of you who live in other parts of the community and use other parts of the community would likely want to be thinking about. So what are the basic ingredients of a walkable of a walkable place? One is good sidewalk conditions. Another is safe intersections and street crossings. The third is sort of the mix of shade and benches and landscaping that can make a place attractive and comfortable, especially as people age, that they want to have a place to sit down on their walk and they want to be able on a hot day to walk in the shade, etc. And also sort of in that mix is well-maintained sidewalks. We'll talk a little bit about snow clearance, but obviously that's a huge issue in Massachusetts. And then the last piece, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end, is the mix of destinations. So if the basic ingredients of a comfortable walking environment and safe walking environment are there, then the thing that gets people out walking is the fact that there are places within walking distance to go to. In other words, the thing that gets people out and about every day, there are people that just go for a walk to get exercise, and certainly some of you may do that. But the other thing that keeps people walking is the fact that they can run errands on foot. They can walk to the grocery store, they can go to the post office, etc. It doesn't have to be, the middle of Paris and the most fabulous walking environment you could imagine. It just has to be a place where you can go and do what you need to do on foot. So that's what we're going to look at. This is kind of a little more detailed. We're going to look at the sidewalks. We're going to look at traffic speeds. We're going to look at how the intersections and street crossings work, looking at things like the signals and the signs and the crosswalk markings. We're going to look at parking. We're going to look at bus stops. That's why it's important. We're going to split up and look at these two different pieces of the neighborhood. And then sort of we call them amenities. We don't think of shade and benches as amenities. We think that they're a critical part of the walking environment, but they're often called amenities. So sidewalk conditions. So the basics are that the sidewalk is wide enough. We think it's really important to have it be wide enough that two people can walk side by side, because for many people, walking is a social activity. And also for people in a wheelchair, for people with disabilities, there's a minimum width. So the very minimum is 4 feet, but 5 feet is sort of the standard basic neighborhood sidewalk. When you're in a commercial area, if you think of the main shopping street, you might want 20 feet of sidewalk. We certainly don't need that in the neighborhood. If you had 20 feet of sidewalk, actually it would feel weird. It's too big for here, so that varies. But in a neighborhood like this, 5 feet. It needs to be smooth and unobstructed. That's one of the things you're going to see here, and those of you who know this neighborhood know that is not the case here. So this picture, the picture over on the right, it's not a perfect example of it, but basically the sidewalk is many of the sidewalks near here are quite broken up. Brendan and I came last week and looked, and there are lots of places there are lots of places with no sidewalks, but there are also lots of places where the sidewalk is very uneven, and I even tripped on one of them. So that's a very important piece of the environment. Then, creating some separation between moving traffic and the people on the sidewalk. So often if you have a line of trees, that makes a big difference. You feel very different when you're walking down the sidewalk and there's something between you and moving traffic. The other thing that works very well for that is on-street parking. So we actually are fans of on-street parking. Now, that doesn't mean that on little side streets where there's not much traffic, you want to have the streets lined with parking. But if it's a fast-moving road, so like Route 81, there are sidewalks along a lot of Route 81. There are a lot of other issues with how that works as a walking environment. But when you're walking if you're walking down the sidewalk on Route 81, whoa.
Can I turn the light off? I'm sorry.
You guys should tell me. I mean, it's pretty dark without it, but is there a way to turn some of the Do you like that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. But anyway, not so good for the video. Anyway, when you're walking down a street like Route 81, where the high-speed traffic is basically right next to the sidewalk, that is not a very comfortable place to walk. So we're going to observe when we're out how that feels. And again, it depends on the type of street. And then the other thing that we're going to look at is curb cuts or driveways. So one of the characteristics of a comfortable walking environment is that the sidewalk is not constantly opened up with curb cuts and driveways, and that the driveways that are there are pretty narrow and have what's called a tight turning radius. So if you have a curve, a very wide curve, like think about a ramp on a highway that lets you turn without even slowing down, right? You can drive around the corner at 35 miles an hour. Not a comfortable place to cross if you're a pedestrian or to walk. Whereas when you have a very tight, sort of a right angle turn, like the driveways into most people's private homes, a car has to come almost to a stop to turn into that. And so we're going to look at that because that makes a big difference in how comfortable it is to walk down the sidewalk and the speed of traffic. So, by the way, there'll be a test at the end. No, I'm kidding. But this is just sort of, we're talking about a bunch of the things that go into what makes a good walking environment. Then, and we're not obviously going to see all of this today, but the maintenance of the streets and sidewalks is very important. Now, snow and ice, absolutely critical. I think Fall River has a snow shoveling ordinance. I think we talked about that.
They don't enforce it though.
But they don't enforce it. Okay, so that's, now that you guys are becoming walking champions, one of the things to really, really think about, and if you're going to work collectively on something, that might be something to work on. A number of Massachusetts cities and towns have started to take this much more seriously, and the sidewalk clearance has indeed gotten better. Because you need people saying that it's important, and saying not just it's something you can get a ticket for, but it's neighborly. It's important for the quality of life for you and your neighbors. It's a huge issue for seniors in Massachusetts when the Department of Public Health has done focus groups with seniors about what are the impediments to walking for them. Snow and ice is right up at the top of the list. And I don't know how many of you in the room limit your activities when it's snowy because the sidewalks are not adequately cleared. So that's a big deal. That's a big public health issue. It's a big equity issue. It's something people in the disabilities community, it's a very, very big issue. So, like I said, there are cities and towns that have tackled it. There's no such thing as perfection. You know, when we have these huge storms back to back, I mean, it's tough. I mean, Walk Boston tried, you know, we push hard on it, but we also know that, you know, getting to what we really want to see is really hard work. But Boston and Cambridge and Somerville have all taken a much more assertive stance lately on snow and ice and issued a lot of warnings. It's not so much giving tickets, but giving warnings, and then telling people why it's important. Because for a lot of people, if you're young and able-bodied, it doesn't seem like such a big deal. You know, whoops, you climb out of the, you know, you climb over the snow. But so telling people why it's important, I think, is a really big deal. Then things like making sure that crosswalks are painted. We're going to see a lot of faded crosswalks in this neighborhood. There are a lot of places where the crosswalks have basically disappeared. And then one of my favorite, because it's easy to fix, but it's a real issue, is where shrubs just overgrow the sidewalk. Again, if you're young and able-bodied and there's not a lot of traffic, you step into the street. But if you're in a wheelchair and you come to this, or you have mobility issues and you come to those bushes, they're really in your way. So that's a pretty easy one to fix, but it's something that people need to realize is important. So then we're going to talk about speed. And we don't have to go over the details except to say that the relationship between speed and pedestrian safety is huge. And if you're hit by a car that's moving at 20 miles an hour, and the numbers are different for seniors. Seniors are more vulnerable to injuries, and I think probably we all know that. But at 20 miles an hour, if you're hit by a car, 95% of people survive. And at 40 miles an hour, about 5% of people survive. Now, this isn't to say that all cars everywhere need to drive slowly, because there are places where cars are driving fast. But if you have neighborhood streets or shopping streets where you want people to feel comfortable walking, vehicle speed is really important. So it's something we're going to look at when we're walking around. And how can you affect speed? Well, one of the things you can do is make travel lanes narrower. So if you have wide travel lanes, cars drive faster. And one of the ways, the least expensive way to make travel lanes narrower is actually just to paint a fog, what's called a fog line, which is the stripe on the side. Because drivers, the way you perceive the driving environment, just painting that fog line narrows the lane for your eyes and cars slow down. So, and I know Fall River has been paying a lot of attention lately to adding bike lanes. So there's this combination, it's really a win-win. You're creating space for bicycles, and you're slowing the cars down that are next to it if you narrow the lanes. So that's a very important tool, and it's very important to keep in mind that that's one way to do this. So other kinds of things are, well, I said bicycle lane. Sometimes there isn't quite space for bicycle lane, but just adding that, it's called a fog line, the right-hand lane, actually slows traffic down. I mentioned sort of the tight turning radii, so if you look at that driveway, that's a driveway that cars really have to slow down to turn into. It's not that wide open thing. And then vertical elements, trees, signs, buildings, if you're on a street that has buildings up to the sidewalk, all of those things narrow the visual field for drivers and slow drivers down. And it's something that traffic engineers and designers have figured out only recently. They used to think the safest driving environment was basically when you removed all those quote-unquote obstructions and you didn't have trees and things like that near the side of the road. Well, it turns out, yes, for an interstate, for a highway, you don't want things nearby. But on city streets, you actually want things near the street so drivers feel like they're in a contained space and they slow down. So things like street trees have multiple benefits. They obviously provide shade and make it a more attractive environment, but they actually also help slow cars down. Then safe intersections and crossings. This is another thing we're going to see in this neighborhood. A number of intersections and crossings which are not, at this point in time, not looking particularly great. I will say that coming down 81, the city is doing some major reconstruction. And when you get closer to downtown, there's some real changes happening on 81, which looks like they're adding pedestrian traffic signals, they're adding better crosswalks, curb cuts in the islands, and so on. If we go to the intersection here on 81, what you'll see is an intersection that has not yet been worked on for pedestrians, and it's really quite daunting to get across the street down there. So we'll see that. But so pedestrian countdown signals are now standard. That's the thing where you get the walk or don't walk, and it tells you how many seconds there are to get across the street, how many seconds of green you have. Very important, a really important safety measure. The new signals that are going in have those. So that's good to see, but the signals immediately near here actually don't even have walk, don't walk signs. They literally don't have anything for pedestrians. And then, like I said, the painted crosswalks are really important. There are a number of ways to make safer crosswalks for pedestrians. I know having a crosswalk in front of the senior center is something that's been talked about. If you have a mid-block, what that's called is a mid-block crossing when there isn't actually an intersection. Traffic engineers aren't always crazy about them, but you can do them, and you can add quite a number of safety features. Some of them are things like having a raised crosswalk, and it's not a traffic hump, which we used to do. We don't do those really anymore because they're very hard to maintain, and they're very hard on cars, and they're hard for snow plowing and all sorts of reasons. But having a raised intersection, which has a much more gradual ramp up and then has the crossing at the level of the sidewalk, is very effective. It slows traffic down, makes it much safer. These little signs in the middle of the street, which we're always looking for the perfect thing to call them, but the in-street signs are very effective tools. They slow traffic. So they do a couple things. First of all, drivers see them because they're in the street. Whereas signs on the side of the street, if you put up new signs, the drivers see them for a few days and then they're just habituated, you don't even see them. These things, because they're in the field of view that the driver's looking at, they see them, and they're actually a very effective, very inexpensive tool to use. And then there are all sorts of more expensive things with flashing lights and so on. You can also have pedestrian actuated signals where you push a button and then you actually have there's a red light for the cars and you can go across the street. You need to have a relatively high number of crossings to make sense to have that kind of an investment, but there are a number of treatments you can do for mid-block crossings. In Massachusetts, it's legal and sort of standard to just have the two white lines, but they are much, much less visible than having what's called laddered markings or zebra markings like this. And there are a bunch of different ways that you can do the zebra markings. Some of them are skinny like this, some of them are fat, but anyway, they're much more visible to drivers. And so we highly recommend that communities use the zebra crossing markings so that drivers know that they're crosswalks. Obviously, we're not going to observe this today, but lighting is really important. You know, for those of you, I assume that most of you in the room are also drivers. As you know, it's hard to see people at night. And so the lighting at crosswalks is important. And as is for pedestrians, that you should wear clothes that people can see you in. I mean, not today, but my standard clothing, I wear black pants and a dark coat all winter. It's like, I know as a driver that's hard to see. So thinking about being conscious of that as a walker yourself is something that's important to also pay attention to. So another tool of the trade is what's called curb extensions. Again, I think there were some on 81, on the new part where 81 was being redone. Were there? Yeah. So this is where you pull the corner out a little bit. So that does a bunch of things that are good for pedestrians. Number one, it makes the street crossing shorter, because if you have those bump outs on the two sides, you're sort of narrowing the street, so you don't have quite as far to cross. Number two, it keeps parked cars from being right up at the corner, which means that you can see the cars coming when you're standing out on the island, and they can see you standing there. And that's really important, because in a lot of places, if there are cars parked right up to the corner, it's actually it's hard for the drivers to see pedestrians and for the pedestrians to see the cars that are coming. So this is a very standard way of improving pedestrian safety, making the environment more comfortable. It's also, however, relatively expensive. This is not something that the city can just come out and do with a can of paint. It involves construction. It often involves working on the drainage for the street, because they're moving. Often the drains are near the corners, and this is in the same place. So this is the kind of thing that most communities are making this investment in places where there are relatively high numbers of pedestrians or high-speed traffic and things like, or a lot of traffic. So things where they want to make an investment. So you're much more likely to see this sort of in shopping areas and stuff than on like neighborhood streets. But some communities are in fact installing quite a lot of them at crossings to parks, for example. And I know that's the destination for one of the walks, is to look at a park. So that's something to think about when you're up there. Are there corners where something like this would make sense? I mentioned on-street parking. Just a couple of pictures. If you look at the picture on the left, if you're walking in that environment and you think about that when you're out walking, how different it feels if the cars that are in that parking lane were moving. Those are big vehicles moving right near you. It's very different when you have a line of parked cars. It's basically a wall between the pedestrian and the moving cars. Bus stops are another important place to look. So the picture on the left is actually, I'm going to do this again, Stafford Street?
Yes.
Stafford. That is the disappeared bus stop, crosswalk at one of the bus stops on Stafford Street. So thinking about bus stops, and depending on if it is at an intersection, but thinking about wherever there's a bus stop, people need to be able to cross the street, because they're coming and going, and in one direction or the other, they're going to be crossing the street. So being really aware of the crossings at bus stops. Also think about what is provided for people waiting for the bus. How many of you in the room actually use the bus sometimes? Wow. Okay. So none of you. That's pretty interesting. So that says something about the level of transit service that there is, because presumably if it was super convenient, many of you might think about using it. But it also may have something to do with the way that people who ride the bus are sort of treated by the environment, which is, hey, we're going to put out a bus stop, but you can't really get across the street. There are no benches. There's no information about the bus. There's nothing there to tell you that story.
Too, appearance. I was up at Griffin Park, that people know, I'm sure. It's not too far from City Hall, but I was walking back to City Hall, and it's considered a rather tough neighborhood. And there was this little corner market called Al's Variety, and it had 100 signs up for cigarettes and lottery tickets and other things. But I needed a drink, so I wanted to check it out. So I opened the door, and right to my right was shelves with all fresh fruits and vegetables.
Uh-huh.
And then they had a case with a lot of meats and other kinds of things. So that's another thing is, are people going to be either concerned about going into those stores or how do they project what they have that will get
Right.
people to understand that this is a good place to
Yeah, I know. I mean, and I know in Boston, some of the pattern in different neighborhoods is really different. So some of the neighborhoods, a lot of the small corner stores actually have fresh food, and in other neighborhoods, none of them do. And why that developed over the years, I don't really know, but it's definitely the case.
Well, but also a lot of young people frequent these markets. They only have a couple of dollars, so it gets them involved really early in selecting fruit rather than a candy bar or something.
Right. No, I mean, that's clearly a big issue. Yeah, and the kids, I think when people have looked at what kids buy in the corner stores, it's not a happy story. They're not buying an apple. So.
I just also want to add in, because Elsie brought this up, that this group that we have called together to be champions to do these audits can be a springboard because while we've been coming to particularly this neighborhood, this senior center, we have heard, oh, is there going to be a walking group? Oh, we really would benefit from a walking group. So we're hoping that maybe that's another outcome of this audit, walkability assessments.
That would be great. And obviously the walking groups could be, they could feed back and forth, talking about being champions with the city and also doing the walking. So I don't know how many of you carry smartphones. Probably some of you do. Mm-hmm. So there's an app. Oh yeah, I think because we went to the website and looked. There's the city uses something called C-Click Fix, which is a smartphone app for reporting things that you see. So if you go out and you download the app, and then because you're in Fall River, it's GPS activated. So if you're in Fall River, it knows you're in Fall River, and if you go to Chelsea, it knows you're in Chelsea. And you take a picture. There's a way that basically you can upload a picture and a comment, and that will get the reporting back to City Hall about the things that need to be fixed. And especially things like crosswalk painting and things, or the city, they want to hear about them. And in fact, when we met with municipal staff, they actually specifically said, yeah, this is the stuff we really want to hear about it, because we can fix it and we can respond to citizen comments, and it's really important. The other thing is, if you build a buzz in City Hall that these are issues that there are people that care about, that's how you get activation, obviously.
And I think one of a negative comment was just that some people were using it to complain and repeatedly, but what they were saying was, on the other hand, the more variety of people that are calling and identifying a real problem without using it as a way to degrade the city, just a more positive thing. And also another thing that I have brought out at a couple of meetings is calling the police department when you have problems crossing the road, if you're threatened, by cars zooming down the lane. In particular, I'm thinking of Bedford Street, and I called the Officer Smith at the police department and reported this to him, and he was on it immediately, looking up. I got the number, I got the license plate number, and I called it in, and he called the person. Person admitted to having, nearly run me down, and a ticket was issued. And there's, it seems to me that there's no greater learning experience than getting a ticket. But of course, this new grant, the officers are out there and actually educating people rather than
Right,
giving a ticket.
right, which I think is also important. So if you see people out, that the city is participating in this, and
I'm going to call the city to see who's coming.
oh, okay, because we should actually head out so we can.
And there's water right here.
Okay, great. So let me hand out. We have a map of the 2 routes that we're going to do, and what we'll try and do is sort of have half of us take one route and half of us take the
In
other.
this group, we could get a few individuals that, besides doing this, could also just get out and walk for their own personal exercise.
Sure,
and
no,
get
that's
out
great.
and do good things.
That's great.
Because unfortunately, I work alone and I don't like it. But I was, hoping right now I'm going to hook up with Cheryl, and
That's great.
So hopefully that will also
Yeah,
contribute.
yeah. See you.
All right.
All right. Have a good walk.
That's a popular area.
Slow traffic and alert people to people are crossing.
And if people cut their bushes back, oh yeah.
If people cut their bushes back, that's a good one.
I go for my walk, I'm always hitting a freaking tree.
All right, well let's
So
start
I
going.
take the cane, I hit the tree with it.
Right away.
That's not an inexpensive fix, unfortunately, right? Because you have to relay the sidewalk. So it's a big deal. Probably this is not the primary way that people come into the senior center. They probably mostly
They come
come in
from the
from the
back, I
back
believe.
or maybe from the driveway. So, I mean, I'm guessing that's why they've marked it, and at least they've marked it. But
Yeah, we try.
But it is a way. It is actually a good way for municipalities to communicate, to get information
Yes,
from people.
absolutely.
Yeah, it opens it up in a way that if you make a phone call and you sit on hold and you get somebody who has to
Right,
take a
speed.
message, this way you just you send it in, and a
Fast
lot of cities
communication.
are actually very good at responding to getting notices. Okay.
From here to I don't know how many feet. Like you see, some of them are colored painted.
What do you mean for no parking?
Probably is that it?
That's what that's
Yeah.
marking. Usually,
Yeah.
don't park there.
Yeah, so many feet from.
So this is the kind of thing where it's kind of like in rotation. So this at least has a curb ramp. There are many corners that don't have a curb ramp.
Yeah.
So unless there were people using this for whom it was a problem, probably the city wouldn't come back for a long time. But so what the real problem at this place is, so Brenda and I stood here for a long time. If you want to cross the street here, there are 3 different signal phases, none of which, first of all, there are no pedestrian signals at all, right? It's just traffic signals. But the other thing which we noticed is there are 3 phases here. One, Tucker has a green. Okay, you wouldn't cross the street then. 2, people turning left onto Tucker have a left arrow.
Yeah.
The 3rd, people turning right have a right arrow. Now, when you get an arrow, that as a driver, that usually means it's a sort of free right or free left. If you just have a green ball and you're turning into a street, presumably you're looking for people crossing the street because it's not saying you have a free. There is no time when crossing Tucker doesn't have a moment when cars are told that they basically have an open turn.
Yeah.
It's bizarre. I actually can't remember seeing a street where, so in theory, there is a crosswalk here, but basically it's set up as if there's not.
Right.
Continuous curb cut, right? across the street here. There's, you know, and now for them, it would be very complicated not to do that.
Good thing our visitor notices